In the early 1960s, London is one of, if not the cultural capital of the world. Young people dance to swing and early rock music in clubs. The post-war generation begins to express itself through fashion, and the big city promises boundless opportunities for its inhabitants. But fear is also omnipresent during these years. Corpses keep turning up in the Thames. The lifeless bodies of young women, all strikingly similar. They all had the same job. They were all about the same height. All of them had their teeth pulled out, and they were all murdered. The faceless serial killer on the loose soon earned himself a nickname, Jack the Stripper. But who was he? That is a question that people are still asking themselves today. And it is precisely this question that we want to get to the bottom of today. On February 2nd, 1964, the weather is typical of London. It is cold and gray. That morning, a body is washed up on the banks of the Thames. No one suspects that this discovery will lead to the hunt for a serial killer. But that does not lessen the shock of finding the body. The body was washed up right in front of Linden House. At the time, Linden House was the bustling clubhouse of a London-based sailing club, the London Corinthian Sailing Club. Linden House still exists today. It is now an event center for courses, parties, and weddings. Today, there is no trace of the body that washed up right in front of the terrace in February 1964. The dead woman is Hannah Telford, a 30-year-old sex worker originally from Northumberland. She is the mother of a 7-year-old son. Hannah's body is naked. Her underwear has been stuffed into her mouth. The rest of her clothes are missing, except for her stockings. Several teeth are missing from her mouth, which were obviously removed violently shortly before or after her death. The 30-year-old was strangled and then simply thrown into the River Thames in London. Even today, working as a sex worker is not only stigmatized, but also dangerous. This was even more so in the 1960s. Back then, people didn't carry cell phones to make emergency calls or share their location, pepper spray, or anything else. A few sex workers hid small pocket knives in their shoes so they would have something in case of an emergency, but even that offered little protection against violent clients. Women like Hannah Telford are particularly vulnerable. At that time, running brothels and offering such services on the street was illegal. So you had to organize yourself underground somehow, not attract attention, but still be well connected enough to have enough clients. This is precisely why many women work with pimps. Although illegal, they can at least offer a little protection, even if this entails further risks. The other option is to work alone and be on your own. I don't even need to mention the social contempt that women in this line of work face. The press is therefore all over the Hannah Telford case. For the tabloid media, the case is a perfect, daring scandal from the wild capital. As an adult, her son later recalls how wrong the reporting feels in retrospect, and how little his mother was actually appreciated as a person. But if the sensationalist articles and reports have any positive aspect, it is that the case is receiving attention that is not a given for a murder of this kind. The police launch an extensive murder investigation. At times, more than 100 police officers are working on the case. Among other things, investigators conduct 10,000 door-to-door inquiries in the Hammersmith district where Hannah was found. Unfortunately, the case remains unsolved, and the police are unable to prevent the perpetrators from committing further murders. 2 months after Hannah, on April 8, 1964, the body of Irene Lockwood is washed ashore. The 26-year-old is found at Corney Ridge in the Chiswick district, only about a mile from where Hannah was found. Irene was last seen in a pub in the neighborhood. Irene was also a sex worker and was expecting a baby at the time of her death. The modus operandi and Irene's condition are so similar that the police are certain that the murders of Hannah and Irene must be connected. Both women were strangled, both women were found almost naked, and both women were missing teeth. This second murder only fuels the press further. Initially, the media simply referred to the mysterious killer as the Hammersmith murderer, named after the district where he is believed to be operating. But after a while, the name Jack the Stripper emerges. Stripper because he always seems to undress his victims, and it won't be long before a third murder is added to the list. But before that, there is something that surprises many. An emotional confession. On April 27, 1964, a 57-year-old man walks into a police station in the Nottingham district of London. Kenneth Archibald, known as Kenny, appears distraught when he shows up at the police station just under 3 weeks after Irene's body was found. He's already been questioned as a witness in the Irene Lockwood murder case. The police had found Kenny's business card in the apartment of the murdered Irene. At the time, Kenny was working as a caretaker at the Holland Park Lawn Tennis Club. But he didn't just do the usual caretaker's duties at the tennis club. No, he also arranged sex workers for clients. And occasionally, he was a client himself. That's why Irene Lockwood had his business card. She often offered her services at the tennis club and encountered Kenny several times. However, he denied this in his first interview. He claimed to have never seen or known the victim. However, he drastically changes his statement when he shows up at the police station on April 27th. Not only does he blurt out that he did know Irene Lockwood and lied during the first interview, he also says something that surprises even the police officers. "I killed her. I have to tell someone." So has the police already caught Jack the Stripper? It certainly looks that way. Kenny Archibald even leads the police to the pub where Irene was last seen. He vividly describes how he was talking to Irene nearby on the banks of the Thames. Then an argument broke out over money. According to the transcript, he tells investigators, "I must have lost control. I put my hands around her neck. Then I took off her clothes and threw her into the river. I took her clothes home and burned them." At first glance, this is actually a fairly detailed confession, and some of it seems to add up. As Kenny described it, Irene was murdered, her clothes were missing, and she was found in the Thames. The problem: this confession was most likely a lie. Kenny even ended up in court in June 1964. But then he suddenly pleaded not guilty. He claims that when he made the alleged confession, he was drunk and severely depressed. And apart from his confession, there is nothing to incriminate him as Jack the Ripper. According to an article, Kenny was almost a frail old man at 57 and wore a hearing aid. Despite his confession, even the police are certain that he is not a serial killer. Especially since he doesn't mention the other murders, those of Hannah and the ones I'm about to tell you about, with a single word. Because just 3 days before Kenny's false confession, another body is found. On April 24th, 1964, the next female corpse appears. It is found in an alley near 199 Boston Manor Road in the Brantford district. The dead woman is 22-year-old Helen Barthelli. She's originally from Blackpool and, like the other 2 murder victims, came to London to work as a sex worker. Once again, it is clear that the same perpetrator must be responsible. Like the other 2, Helen was strangled and several of her teeth were removed. However, one thing distinguishes Helen's body from the others. Her body was not dumped in the Thames after she was murdered. This allows investigators to find interesting clues. There are paint splatters on her body. The paint can be analyzed at the time. It is commonly used by auto repair shops, so it seems obvious to investigators that the serial killer must work in such a shop. But before they can follow this lead, the next body turns up. The next woman is also found outside the Thames. On July 14, 1964, Mary Fleming is found in front of 48 Berrymat Road in Chiswick. Not only is the modus operandi almost identical, but just like with Helen, paint splatters are found on Mary's body. This time, there are even witness statements. A young couple claims to have seen the killer together with Mary on their way home. The man was wearing a cap and was about the same height as Mary. He looked as if he had been trying to undress Mary. Fortunately for the police, the two witnesses reported their observations, providing at least some initial clues. Unfortunately, however, this evidence is not strong enough to find a suspect, and so the murders by the unknown killer continue. On November 25, 1964, the body of 21-year-old Frances Brown is found. She was last seen alive just under a month earlier. Frances was also a sex worker, and a colleague had seen her get into a customer's car on October 23rd. Frances reappeared dead just 1 month later. Her body was found in a parking lot on Haunton Street in the Kensington district. The police assumed that her last client was Frances's murderer. Fortunately, her colleague can still remember the car and the man. The car was a gray passenger car, probably a Ford Zephyr. Based on the statement, a composite sketch of Jack the Stripper is also produced. It shows a round to angular face with slightly protruding ears, a broad nose and thin lips, as well as dark hair with a side parting. Despite this partial success, the series of murders continues into 1965. On February 16th, a young Irish woman named Bridget O'Hara is found in the Acton district. Her body is lying behind a storage shed on the Heron Trading Estate in a small industrial area. As the body is already partially mummified, it is assumed that Bridget has been there for some time. This is consistent with the fact that she was last seen on January 11th, more than a month before her body was found. This location is very different from the others. While the killer was active in the heart of London in 1964, this time the body was found far to the west of the city and far from the Thames. Bridget was last seen near a hostel called Rodham House, which is miles away in Hammersmith. There she was seen in the company of a very short man wearing a trilby hat. Unfortunately, his face was not seen, so it is not possible to match him to the composite sketch. But Jack the Stripper's handwriting on the body is unmistakable. Several of Bridget's teeth were removed, and there are again paint splatters on the body. This paint has been found on 4 of the 6 murder victims and is the police's best chance of somehow tracking down the killer. As already mentioned, the police quickly determined that the paint was used in the automotive industry. So hundreds of paint shops and workshops across London are searched. The police find a match very close to where Bridget O'Hara's body was found. At that time, there was a spray paint factory called Sean Kilby in the industrial area in Acton. And right next to this factory is a small, disused electrical substation. This, in turn, belonged to a disused aircraft engine factory located right next to the spray paint factory. And that was the key to the case. The perpetrator was probably not even employed at the spray paint factory. Instead, the bodies of Helen, Mary, Frances, and Bridget were hidden in the empty electrical substation. The spray paint factory was right next door. And on the outer wall right next to the power station, there were large fans that blew paint particles from inside the factory into the small electrical substation. And that's how 4 of the bodies ended up with these strange paint splatters. Based on the location where the last 4 bodies were found, the police already suspected that the perpetrator had kept the dead women somewhere for a while. With the electrical substation now identified, it is also clear where. To have found this hiding place, the perpetrator must have been very familiar with Acton, at least according to the police. So thousands of men from the surrounding area are questioned again, and the police find their first suspect. Shortly after Bridget's murder, the police announced that they now have a circle of about 20 suspects. A short time later, they say they have narrowed the circle down to 16 men, then to 10, then to 3. However, as there is still no concrete evidence, the names of these men are not made public at the time. And perhaps for another reason. Because with the murder of Bridget O'Hara, the series of murders comes to an end. The police seem to have finally found the Hammersmith murderer's hideout, but at the same time, he goes into hiding. Of course, murders continue to be committed in London, but none of them fit the serial killer's profile. It is almost as if the killer led the police to Bridget's body right on his doorstep and then simply disappeared. And because there are no new murders after Bridget, the public's appetite for updates also dries up. And at some point, the investigation is also closed, at least until 1970. That's when John Duraus, the lead investigator at the time, publishes his memoirs. He revisits his biggest cases, and of course the Hammersmith murderer is among them. John Duraus writes that he was close to arresting the killer in 1965. However, the killer took his own life and beat him to it. In fact, Duraus solved the case anyway. But who was the man Duraus believed to be the killer? At the time of the murders, Scotsman Mungo Ireland was working as a night watchman at Heron Trading Estate. This is where the victims' bodies were allegedly hidden. Mungo was identified as a suspect shortly after Bridget's murder. He is aware of the police's suspicions and cannot bear it. He takes his own life shortly after the investigation in 1965. In his final note to his wife, he writes, "I can't take it anymore. It may be my fault, but not all of it. I'm sorry that Harry is a burden to you. Give the boy my love. Farewell. P.S. To save you and the police the trouble of looking for me, I'll be in the garage." And that's where Mungo was found dead. Many see his death as an implicit admission of guilt, including chief negotiator John Duraus. And the series of murders ends with the murder of Bridget O'Hara. The thing is, however, there is no physical evidence against Mungo, and he was never even officially questioned. Even the farewell letter, which could sound suspicious, can be explained in other ways. Mungo and his wife had been having marital problems for some time. He also drank a lot of alcohol. Perhaps he blamed that rather than the murders. And as for the police, it fits that Mungo actually had a court date on the morning of his death. He was facing charges for a traffic offense. The Harry mentioned in the letter was Mungo's brother, with whom his wife apparently had problems. Mungo Ireland even has an alibi for the time of the disappearance of Bridget O'Hara, the serial killer's last victim. He was in his hometown in Scotland doing odd jobs. This alibi was also confirmed by his employer. A journalist from the Sun newspaper discovered this in 1972. He put forward the theory that John Duraus had simply chosen a perpetrator for the Hammersmith murders who could no longer contradict him. Otherwise, the murders would have been the only unsolved case in Duraus' portfolio. And Duraus was very proud of his flawless portfolio of criminal cases. But since the modus operandi was always the same, this actually means that if Mungo was ruled out as the perpetrator of one murder, he can also be ruled out for the other 5. Mungo Ireland did not return to London from Scotland until several weeks later. However, this was exactly one day before Bridget O'Hara's body was found. He was suspected mainly because he was supposedly familiar with the industrial area. However, he had only worked there as a night watchman for 3 weeks. The perpetrator had repeatedly hidden bodies there over a period of months. In 2006 and 2007, the Hammersmith murders were reopened. Scotland Yard's final statement said that the circumstantial evidence against Mungo Ireland was very strong, and that the officers who conducted the latest review of the case believed he was most likely responsible. Scotland Yard is therefore clearly not ruling out the possibility that Mungo Ireland may have faked his alibi and killed himself to avoid being convicted as a serial killer. Unfortunately, Mungo Ireland can no longer be questioned. It is therefore worth taking a look at the other suspects. Freddie Mills was a real star in Great Britain during his lifetime. In 1948, he became world champion in his weight class in boxing. But even after the end of his active sports career, he remained a colorful media figure. Freddie was a fixture in London high society and owned a nightclub in the heart of London. However, Freddie Mills also got involved in shady deals and hung out with London gangsters. The series of murders committed by Jack the Stripper ended in February 1965 with the murder of Bridget O'Hara. And just 5 months later, in July 1965, Freddie Mills was found dead. He's sitting in the back seat of his car, parked in a side street in Soho with a gunshot wound. He has a gunshot wound to the head and a rifle wedged between his knees. The police rule the case a suicide. Freddie's family and friends are convinced that he was murdered and that rival gangsters are responsible for his death. To this day, wild theories circulate that would go beyond the scope of this video. But if you would find an extra video about Freddie Mills interesting and would like to dive into the London underworld of the last century with Insolito, feel free to let me know in the comments. But first, let's get back to Jack the Stripper and what he might have had to do with Freddie Mills. Or rather, why the theory exists that he could be Jack the Stripper. In 2001, ex-gangster Jimmy Tippit Jr. published a book in which he put forward the theory that Freddie Mills was the mysterious serial killer. Tippit writes that the former boxing community was very close-knit at the time, almost like a secret brotherhood. That's why many people are still silent today. But Tippit claims to have learned from some people in these circles that Freddie was afraid. He was afraid of the police. And he was afraid of being convicted as Jack the Stripper. And that's exactly why he took his own life. Freddie Mills had already been linked to the murders in the early 1970s. A journalist tipped off the police at the time that he had heard numerous reports during his research that Freddie Mills was the Hammersmith murderer. The journalist even goes so far as to claim that a police officer told him that it was clear to everyone that Freddie Mills was the perpetrator. There were also rumors in London's West End that Freddie had committed the murders of the women. There is also a perfect explanation for why the investigation team and John Duraus did not arrest Freddie. At least that is what some people believe. Both John Duraus and Freddie Mills are said to have been members of the Freemasons. And brotherhood is one of the highest values of the Freemasons. Whether John Duraus would have gone so far as to let a multiple murderer go free for that reason is open to question. There are many books about the Hammersmith murders, and almost every one of them puts forward different theories. In his book, author David Seabrook claims that a former Metropolitan Police officer was suspected at one point. Several senior investigators were certain that a former colleague must have been behind the murders. Seabrook does not name this former colleague. In another book on the case, a pair of authors claim that the suspect was Superintendent Tommy Butler of the Metropolitan Police's flying squad. However, this theory is not widely accepted. Accordingly, there are no deeper clues that I can present to you here. Much is based solely on speculation and rumors. This also applies to the next suspicion we will discuss. However, this one ultimately has more substance than those mentioned so far. In 2011, a completely new theory emerged in the cold case, which was already almost 50 years old at the time. A name was brought into play that had not been mentioned before, either in the press or by the police. The theory surrounding the alleged solution comes from a pensioner named Neil Milkins, who lives in Abertillery, Wales. He believes he has discovered the true identity of the serial killer, and his name is said to be Harold Jones. So let's go back to 1964, when the series of murders began. Harold Jones lives in the London borough of Hammersmith, where some of the women's bodies were found. In fact, his address on Aldensley Road was within the search radius established for the investigation into the Hannah Telford case. But somehow Harold Jones slipped through the police's net. He was not even questioned. And that despite the fact that Harold Jones's address was in the immediate vicinity of the addresses of Frances Brown and Bridget O'Hara, two of the murder victims. The women live on Southerton Road and Agatha Road. Both streets are just a stone's throw away from Harold Jones's address. And the location where Hannah Telford's body was found is only a mile away from his address. Okay, that applies to hundreds of men who lived in Hammersmith at the time. So why exactly is it so dramatic in Harold Jones' case that they failed to question him? The reason is as simple as it is brutal. Harold Jones has a well-kept secret that not even his own wife and daughter know about. He is a convicted double murderer. In 1921, Harold Jones committed 2 horrific murders in his hometown of Abertillery, Wales. He killed 2 schoolgirls in quick succession, 8-year-old Freda Burnell and 11-year-old Florence Niddle. At the time, he was only 15 years old. Harold was working in a small shop called Mordheimer's shop. One day, little Freda Burnell came in to run errands for her parents. Harold lured Freda into a small storage shed and tried to rape her. He beat, strangled, and finally suffocated Freda with a scarf. Because Harold is the last person to have seen Freda, he is charged with her murder. However, there is a twist in court. He is acquitted. And so, shortly afterwards, Harold is able to commit his second murder. Florence Niddle is a friend of the murdered Freda Burnell and lives near Harold. The 11-year-old gets into an argument with Harold. She confronts him in the middle of the street and accuses him of being Freda's murderer, despite his acquittal. This is probably why he kills Florence, in exactly the same way as Freda. The body is found in the attic of his parents' house. Since Harold was again the last person to see the murdered girl, the police investigate him again. This time, much more thoroughly. Harold Jones is ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison for the 2 murders. Beforehand, Harold confesses to the murders of Freda and Florence. He admits that he lured the girls into a trap with the intention of murdering them. But he denies that his motive had any sexual connotations. A psychological evaluation suggests that this is partly true, but also partly nonsense. Nonsense because both Freda and Florence showed clear signs of at least attempted abuse. It is true insofar as the abuse was probably not Harold's actual motive. Rather, the act of murder was exciting for him. This is also supported by traces of semen found on Florence's body. So Harold Jones is a free man again at the time of the murders. And the sketch of Jack the Stripper that was made back then bears a certain resemblance to Harold Jones. The slightly protruding ears, the broad nose, the thin lips. And there's something else that fits Jones surprisingly well. The time when the series of murders stopped. The last Jack the Stripper murder was in 1965. And in the mid-1960s, Harold fell ill and was eventually diagnosed with bone marrow cancer. He died of the disease in 1971. His own daughter only learns after her father's death that he committed 2 murders in 1921. However, she does not believe that her father is Jack the Ripper. She is certain that the police would have caught him back then. Was he really the perpetrator? A BBC documentary from 2019 reveals that Harold Jones changed his job, his address, and his name. This was around the time when the E-Work in Acton was discovered by the police as the place where the bodies were being stored. Harold had worked as an engineer in Acton for a time. He also frequently stayed at a hostel called Rodham House. His daughter later recalled at least 2 occasions when Harold had been away from home for 2 or 3 days and had stayed at Rodham House. It was located directly on Shepherd's Bush Road near Hammersmith, and 3 of the crime scenes were in the immediate vicinity. Perhaps the name of the hostel rings a bell. Bridget O'Hara, probably Jack the Stripper's last victim, was last seen alive nearby. She was accompanied by a rather small man wearing a trilby hat. Harold Jones owned a hat just like that. There are photos of him wearing one. The witnesses who saw Bridget and Mary with the alleged perpetrator noted his short stature. Harold was a small man, and all 6 women killed were between 5 feet and 5 feet 2 inches tall. So they were also strikingly short, but perhaps still shorter than the alleged murderer, who may have felt superior. Many, therefore, now consider Harold Jones to be the prime suspect in the Hammersmith murders. This is mainly due to the aforementioned book from 2011 and a BBC documentary from 2019, which further explored the theory. However, it must also be remembered that Harold Jones was never investigated in this case. The police never even questioned him, let alone suspected him. And the investigation into the series of murders was the largest in British history at the time. Thousands of men were questioned and checked. Could the actual murderer really have been overlooked? As I said, the theory originally came from a pensioner from Harold's hometown. He had been studying Harold's double murder in 1921 for a long time and eventually developed the theory about a connection to the Jack the Stripper murders. He published the book himself. In other words, he put claims out there without them being checked by any authority. The BBC documentary brought to light many details that I just mentioned in my presentation. They support the thesis in the book very well, but these details were also specifically sought out. But sure, there are things that fit amazingly well. So, well in fact, that the BBC team presented their findings to the investigators who worked on the case again in 2006. The head of the investigation team said that he would have considered Harold Johns a prime suspect if he had known everything the journalists had found out. The findings of the documentary were passed on to the Metropolitan Police. The team requested that a new investigation be launched and that the theory surrounding Harold Johns be pursued further. However, the police refused. The official statement was, linking Harold Jones to murders other than those for which he was convicted is purely speculative and lacks any basis in evidence. We contacted the production company and asked for details about the family members mentioned in the television documentary, but we have not received a response. The police therefore do not consider the evidence strong enough to really suspect Harold Jones. Officially, the most famous suspect is not even a suspect. The whole case is confusing and complex. Theoretically, we could close the case here. But there are a few more points I would like to share with you. Most sources agree that the unknown serial killer Jack the Stripper killed 6 women, just like his namesake Jack the Ripper. However, there is some disagreement about this. The perpetrator may have 2 more lives on his conscience. This is controversial because the time frame and modus operandi differ from the other murders. For the sake of completeness, I will tell you about it anyway. On June 17, 1959, 21-year-old Elizabeth Hick was found murdered. This was almost 5 years before the actual series of murders began with Hannah Telford. Elizabeth Hick was also a sex worker and was strangled. Her body was found on the banks of the Thames in Chiswick, very close to where Mary Fleming's body was found years later. Elizabeth's body was found at the edge of a park called Duke's Meadows. This is only about 600 meters away from where Mary was later found on Corney Reachway. However, the cause of death and the location where she was found are the only similarities to the 6 later cases. After all, as mentioned above, almost 5 years passed between Elizabeth's murder and Hannah's. In addition, the macabre feature of Jack the Stripper, the severed toes, is missing. There is also other interesting information about Elizabeth. Unfortunately, I cannot verify this information for you. It comes from the website Unsolved Murders UK, which in turn cites articles from print newspapers from the 1950s and 1960s as sources. We do not have access to these articles, so we can only look at what is written on Unsolved Murders UK. However, this information is so interesting that I would like to mention it here anyway. But for the sake of transparency, I will do so with reservations about the source. The website outlines Elizabeth's daily routine before the murder. It says that she met a friend at around 6 p.m. on June 16th, a professional boxer. I'm sure this rings a bell for some of you. We've already talked about how some people believe that ex-boxer Freddie Mills is the serial killer. But the website also says that the boxer Elizabeth was meeting lived in Stamford Hill. But Freddie Mills lived in Denmark, on the other side of town. However, Trippett also mentioned that the boxing community was very close-knit back then. It is theoretically possible that this boxer who saw Elizabeth on her last day had a connection to Freddie Mills. This unnamed boxer is said to have been violent towards Elizabeth in the past and to have acted as her pimp. Nevertheless, he was apparently ruled out as a suspect. After her appointment with this boxer, Elizabeth is said to have gone to her dressmaker. She then took a ride to Holland Park, where she was supposed to meet a client. The driver dropped her off there at around 1 a.m. and waited for her. Elizabeth never reappeared. It is also interesting to note that Holland Park is located almost exactly between the tennis club where Irene Lockwood was probably on her way and the Hornton car park where Frances Brown's body was found. Although these two events happened 5 years later, it is still intriguing that Elizabeth apparently encountered her killer at that very spot. And this murderer must have driven from Holland Park to Duke Meadows, where Elizabeth was eventually found dead. A bit of mental gymnastics, I know, and all speculation. But it's interesting to see how small the map is for this complex of events and how close the locations are to each other. On November 8, 1963, 22-year-old Gwyneth Reese was found in a landfill on the Thames. Investigators at the time suspected that the young woman may have worked as a stripper. Unfortunately, it is not possible to determine how they came to this conclusion. She was also believed to have been naked, and she was indeed missing several teeth. The murder of the 22-year-old is also closer in time to the rest of the series. Less than 3 months passed between the discovery of Gwyneth and the discovery of Hannah. The time frame and modus operandi therefore fit here. Unfortunately, it is not possible to find out why Gwyneth Reese is not considered one of Jack the Stripper's confirmed victims. There is also another entry for Gwyneth Reese on Unsolved Murders UK. And this time, things are getting a little more concrete for us. It is said that during her time in London, Gwyneth made acquaintances with several gangsters in the East End to whom she offered her services. Among these acquaintances were 2 criminals known as the Cray Twins. 3 guesses as to who was good friends with the Cray Twins. That's right, former boxing champion Freddie Mills. However, some suspect that the friendship fell apart and that the Crays were even responsible for Freddie's murder. According to this, the murdered sex workers worked for the Cray Twins. Because Freddie murdered their protégés, the Crays took revenge and eliminated Freddie. The fact is that Freddie and the twins did business together. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but if it is, it's a very exciting one. The topic of London's gangsters in the 1950s and 1960s may really be worth another video. That wasn't the end of the connections between the murders and other aspects of the gangster scene. Author Anthony Summers, who researched the Jack the Stripper case, claims to have discovered something. Namely, that Hannah Telford and Frances Brown had connections to the so-called Profumo affair. The Profumo affair took place in 1963, a year before the 2 women were murdered. Here I have to digress a little. The Profumo affair was a huge political scandal in Great Britain in 1963. The then Minister of War, John Profumo, had an affair with 19-year-old dancer Christine Keeler. And Christine also had a relationship with a Soviet naval officer at the same time. Against the backdrop of the Cold War, it caused a huge media outcry at the time. In June 1963, Profumo was even forced to resign. Indirectly, the Profumo affair also contributed to the resignation of the Conservative Prime Minister at the time and played a role in the Conservatives' defeat in the 1964 general election. That's the rough historical background. And it is precisely this scandal that Hannah and Frances are said to have had a connection to. They testified in court that an influential doctor named Stephen Ward procured sex workers for high-ranking politicians. Politicians such as John Profumo, for example. This fuels rumors that Frances and Hannah may have been murdered in revenge for their statements. As you may remember, Hannah's body was found with her underwear stuffed in her mouth. It was as if the perpetrator had literally wanted to silence her. However, it is not known whether the other murder victims also had connections to the Profumo affair. On the other hand, it is quite possible that the women knew each other. After all, They all lived in the same part of town and did the same work. And precisely because this work was and still is such a dangerous business, this case is one of the greatest mysteries in British criminal history. It wasn't that long ago, and yet the myth surrounding the murders of Jack the Stripper is already huge and impenetrable. So many people, rumors, possible acquaintances, possible motives, and conceivable connections. And yet there is still no clear answer to the question we started the video with. Who was Jack the Stripper? Unfortunately, that is almost impossible to determine today. DNA testing is now available, but unfortunately, the evidence secured at the time has been lost over the past 60 years. Sometimes such evidence reappears after years, uncatalogued or in the wrong place. But often it remains lost forever, just like the perpetrator himself, who killed at least 6 or 7 people in the 1960s. Hannah Telford, Irene Lockwood and her unborn baby, Helen Barthelli, Mary Fleming, Frances Brown, and Bridget O'Hara. That brings us to the end of today's video. Many places, many names, and above all, one huge mystery. I don't know about you, but I've rarely changed my theories as often as I have with this topic. How about you? Do you think one of the people mentioned here was the serial killer? Do you think Harold Jones is a plausible suspect? Or do you think an underground gangster like Freddie Mills or another boxer is a more likely killer? Or do you even believe in a major political conspiracy surrounding the Profumo affair? I'm really interested in your theories and ideas and look forward to reading your comments. By the way, your comments also support the channel. Any interaction increases the likelihood that the video will be recommended to people who haven't subscribed to Insolito yet. Other than that, there's not much more to say. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching the video, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, ciao everyone.